Welcome. I'm Erik Fleming, host of A Moment with Erik Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Erik Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenterik.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoyed this episode as well.
The following program is hosted by the NBG Podcast Network.
Welcome to another moment with Erik Fleming. I am your host, Erik Fleming, and we've got a jam-packed episode today. Ladies and gentlemen, I have two incredible guests, and we're going to be talking about a lot of things, but the overall theme of this episode is that survival is resistance. And so one guest has dedicated her academic life not only to political science, but specifically dealing with women's issues. And the other guest has written a book dealing with online harassment, and especially from, the stories of women who have been victims of that and who have survived that, right? Because we're trying to better ourselves with language all the time. And one of the things, and it's not just with women, but Black people as a whole, to get out of this victim language and talk about survival, right? And I'll kind of dabble into that in the commentary. Yes, I got something to say. I'm probably going to have something to say after every episode, at the end of every episode, because there's so much going on. But I do want to touch on that a little bit, as we close out. But again, this is going to be a jam-packed show. And the other reason why it's going to be jam-packed is we're going to have another installment of your favorite law firm and my favorite law firm, the internet law firm of Pearson Pearson. Yeah, we've got the lady lawyers back to talk about what's getting ready to happen in the Supreme Court. So, I need y'all to keep listening. I need y'all to subscribe. You can go to patreon.com/Erik Fleming, do that. Or you can go to momenterik.com and do likewise. But, I'm really, really excited about this show, and I hope that you will be too once you hear it. So let's go ahead and kick it off. And as always, we kick it off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Erik. A Utah man was arrested and confessed to the murder of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. ABC is pulling Jimmy Kimmel Live off the air indefinitely after the host's remark about the death of Charlie Kirk drew criticism from the FCC chair. The Federal Reserve lowered interest rates for the first time since December, with Chair Jerome Powell citing a weakening labor market, particularly for Black people. The Congressional Black Caucus is calling for a federal investigation into a series of bomb threats made against several historically Black colleges and universities. Delta State University officials confirmed that the body of a student, Demartravian Reed, was found hanging from a tree on campus, with police stating there was no evidence of foul play at this time. President Donald Trump announced his plans to send National Guard troops to Memphis, Tennessee, to combat the city's high crime rate. An ICE agent in the Chicago area shot and killed Silverio Villegas Gonzalez after he allegedly drove his car at officers during an attempted arrest. A New York judge dismissed 2 terrorism-related charges against Luigi Mangione in the killing of health insurance executive Brian Thompson, but he still faces other criminal counts. Former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro was sentenced to 27 years in prison for plotting a coup to stay in power after his 2022 election loss. President Trump has filed a $15 billion defamation lawsuit against the New York Times and Penguin Random House. Maureen Comey, the daughter of former FBI Director James Comey, is suing the Trump administration over her abrupt firing as federal prosecutor. And Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis has been disqualified from prosecuting the election interference case against President Trump after the Georgia Supreme Court declined her appeal. I am Grace G., and this has been a Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And now it is time for my guest, Dr. Caroline Heldman. Dr. Caroline Heldman is a political scientist and chair of the Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies program at Occidental College in Los Angeles. She is also co-founder of Stand With Survivors and a political commentator for CNN and CBS. Dr. Heldman earned her PhD from Rutgers University and a certificate in executive leadership from the Harvard Business School. She has published 8 books, including Gender, Power, and Politics, The Fight for Gender Equality in the United States, and that's been through Oxford University Press. Her work has been featured in numerous documentaries, including Misrepresentation and The Mask You Live In. She co-founded the New Orleans Women's Shelter, the Lower Ninth Ward Living Museum, End Rape on Campus, Faculty Against Rape, and led the campaign that overturned the time limit on prosecuting rape in California. She is the board president of the TEP Center, the first civil rights museum in New Orleans, and the chair of the board of Altarus Institute, a nonprofit fighting for a stronger democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Dr. Caroline Heldman. All right. Dr. Caroline Heldman. How you doing, ma'am? You doing good?
I'm doing great. How are you, Eric?
I'm doing fine. I'm really, really honored that you accepted my invitation to come on. You know, I tell people all the time that my objective is to get people doing the work and all that stuff. But the main criteria is I get the privilege of talking to people that are smarter than me. And so and it's a weekly thing. So I'm honored that I have this platform where I can talk to these intelligent people. So what I normally try to do at the beginning is what we call my icebreaker phase. So the first icebreaker is a quote. So I want you to give me a response to this quote. Women candidates must be properly masculine to be seen as viable leaders. But the moment they project this, they're penalized by many people for violating traditional norms of femininity. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't. And so far, no woman has figured out how to crack the code on this impossible standard. Talk to me about that quote.
Well, Eric, that's the double bind of women's leadership, which I think is especially pronounced for the presidency. What strikes me is, that damned if you do and damned if you don't. So because of the ways in which we conceptualize leadership, and especially presidential leadership, which is always a contest of manhood, even when women aren't in the race, gender is always a component. The moment at which a woman, projects masculinity in order to be seen as a viable presidential contender. In that moment, she will also be seen as violating norms of femininity, and that will be held against her. So it's kind of this impossible dance that so far no woman has been able to do. I will say that different candidates have taken different tacks, and we've had many, many women run for the presidency. We've had 21 women run quite seriously, and we've had over 100 women throw their name in the hat, but none of them have, as that quote puts it, cracked the code. I think it's interesting to look at like Hillary Clinton, who was kind of straddling the feminine masculine line kind of right down the middle, right? So she's wearing pantsuits, but she's wearing pearls. So she's doing a little straddle, whereas someone like Sarah Palin, if you remember when she ran for the vice presidency, was doing kind of, hyper feminine with the clothing and the makeup that she was wearing, and then hyper masculine with these photos of her, shooting a moose and acting quite tough. And I find it fascinating that in that election, they were both beaten up in very gendered terms. So even though one was trying to approach this double bind of women's leadership by being hyper-masculine and hyper-feminine, and the other was kind of doing more in the middle, being a little bit masculine and a little bit feminine, both of them were really beaten up in the press. And Sarah Palin in particular was pornified. So what we have seen is that to date, women have not been able to overcome this double bind. And I would say that Kamala Harris had the double bind plus. She faced misogynoir, right, which is racism and sexism intersectionally aimed at Black women. So she had an additional kind of barrier to gaining the presidency because she wasn't seen as a viable contender in the eyes of millions of Americans.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to put a pin on a couple of things that you said in there. I think some of my questions will fall into part of the response you had. The next icebreaker is called 20 questions. So I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
Let's do number 13.
Okay. Do you think there is such a thing as unbiased news or media, and why?
So no, there's no such thing as something that lacks a bias, because just the mere fact that you're covering a story, even if you might be covering it right down the center in a way that's removed, the mere fact that you're even choosing to cover a particular story is already a form of bias, in the sense that, as media scholars, we call it agenda setting, where you've made a choice about what is important to talk about. And then other biases come in terms of priming and framing. And priming means what aspects of the story you tend to focus on. And then framing are the stories, like the underlying stories that you tell about it. And so no unbiased media, although I don't think my goal as someone who wants good media, meaning informative, useful media, I don't think the goal is a lack of bias. I think the goal is a focus on objectivity through data and a focus on empathy, which allows us to look at the kind of underlying factors driving a particular issue. I think that much of what we have today, especially if we're talking like Gateway Pundit and Breitbart, and of course the old school Fox News, that's propaganda. So that is media that is intentionally aimed to persuade people of a position, instead of media that is aimed at telling the truth or even attempting to be objective. And so I think it's good to be aware and critical and not consume propaganda, but even media that tries to be objective, I think, it's a great pursuit. It's not one we can ever truly accomplish, and maybe that shouldn't be the goal.
Yeah. All right. So, one of the things, there's some people I kind of want to know why, right? So my question to you is, why did you decide, or what made you decide, to dedicate your academic career to women's studies and gender politics?
Well, I study systems of power, and so I currently hold a position where I'm the chair of gender, women, and sexuality studies. But as a political scientist, I really focus on gender, race, ability, sexuality, body size, class, and their intersections. So, for example, I do a lot of work around fat justice, which I believe is a form of discrimination that hasn't been talked about enough. I do a lot of racial justice work. I push back as often as I can against ageism, and I focus a lot on queer politics as well. All of this to say, once you understand how one system of power works and how it intersects with other systems of power and oppression, it's really hard to just focus on one. I'm definitely very centered around survivor justice, which tends to involve women, although not exclusively. And I'll just add that, men who are survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence have an additional layer of silencing. And so I think it's important to, note that not all survivors are women. But my work is really aimed at addressing intersectional systems of power and trying to, you can't take down one without taking down the intersections as well. So it really is much more of a kind of cohesive fight against multiple systems of oppression.
So do you feel that survival from sexual harassment or sexual assault is a form of resistance?
I do, Eric. That's a great way of putting it. Merely, talking about yourself as a survivor rather than a victim. Obviously, people can choose whatever language fits for them, but it's a very important kind of signal to say, look, you didn't kill me. You didn't stop me. I'm still here. Whatever this injury is that you did to me, I'm surviving it. So yeah, I think that language is really important.
Yeah. All right. And in talking about intersectionality, in one of your many books, because you've written at least 10, if I'm correct.
I'm at 11, Eric. I'm at 11.
Okay. All right. 11. Okay. You highlight Sojourner Truth to discuss the historical importance of intersectionality between race and gender in America. Why do you think it's still hard for activists, scholars, and even politicians to fully commit to intersectionality in the 21st century?
Well, I see a silver lining in the push against DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I see a silver lining pushing back against critical race theory and against intersectionality, which is when multiple marginalized identities overlap and create new and unique and more intense experiences of oppression. And that is that we only see these backlashes when there's actually been a shift in the social order. And so you always get a backlash whenever you are attempting to overthrow or shift power. And what this tells us, the big push against DEI, the big push against all of these various programs is that they've been effective, at least to a certain extent. Now, I will say we have a long way to go when it comes to racial justice, when it comes to gender justice, et cetera. But they wouldn't be trying to outlaw and ban ideas if those ideas hadn't produced some serious shift in the social order. And we see evidence of this shift, right? We do see greater inclusion in terms of social, political, and economic gains in society for traditionally marginalized people. And so I read this as a moment where the backlash is upon us, where ideas, a simple thing like an analytic tool of intersectionality that says, look, the world's complicated, here's a tool to understand it. Something like that is so offensive that it gets banned. It tells me that we are on the right path. Let's put it that way. I think this fight is long from over. I don't think you can ban ideas, especially when they're really good ideas like intersectionality that help us get clarity on some really complex topics.
Yeah. It's been nearly 20 years since the Me Too movement began. Do you think the Me Too movement has changed American political culture to the point where we celebrate a court victory for E. Jean Carroll and have true empathies for survivors of the trafficking of Jeffrey Epstein? Or are we not quite there yet?
Well, I think the Me Too movement did accomplish some things. I don't think that it was a big shift in our culture. When I look at social movements as somebody who studies, the civil rights movement, who studies the gay rights movement and movements for liberation over time, especially in the U.S., I see that social movements have two primary phases. The first is to raise awareness about an issue and put it on the agenda, which, the Me Too movement absolutely did that. And the second part is to put in mechanisms of accountability so that
you can actually address the issue. That second part did not happen. We passed some state laws. We opened some look-back windows so that survivors could come forward even if they were timed out under their particular state's time limit on prosecuting rape. But at the end of the day, we haven't seen systemic change. We haven't seen across the board new policies that will allow us to address sexual violence. So in that regard, I think, and the movement's kind of fizzled and faded. I don't think we've accomplished that. And I just want to note, anytime I'm talking about the Me Too movement, I like to go back in time 130 years to just briefly talk about a history that's been erased. Black women were the first women in the United States to organize a concerted effort against sexual violence when Ida B. Wells and her colleagues got together post-Civil War and pushed back against the systemic rape of Black women that was being used as a tool of terror by vigilantes in the state once slavery fell. We then see another peak with Black women leading up to the civil rights movement. In fact, we know Rosa Parks for her heroics in the civil rights movement. But what folks may not know is that 10 years prior to that, she was leading anti-rape efforts for the NAACP and traveling the country and investigating and pushing back against sexual violence. And then we see the third big peak with the rise of, that is 60s and the 70s and the second wave of the feminist movement, where we see the opening of rape crisis centers. And if you actually Google it online, you go and Google anti-sexual violence work, it will put it at the place where white women enter the conversation. But I think it's really important to not erase that history of Black women. And also in the first peak, Sarah Winnemucca was a Native American woman who was traveling the country and raising awareness about the epidemic of sexual violence against Native women. So when I was one of the early architects of the campus anti-rape movement that rolls into the Me Too movement in 2017. And I can tell you we were standing on the shoulders of great women whose efforts have been erased, right? Because oftentimes the efforts of women of color get erased from history.
What do you think is the biggest impediment to the accountability piece?
I think the biggest impediment to the accountability piece is that there are powerful men who maintain systems, who don't want to give up that power and don't want to be held accountable, who essentially the people in power are not going to relinquish that power. If you look at who the serial perpetrators are, many of these are men with a lot of prestige, a lot of resources. I think, the Jeffrey Epstein case is a perfect example where you have, the president of the United States mentioned in the Epstein files. As we know, you have former President Bill Clinton mentioned in the Epstein files. This is a trafficker, Jeffrey Epstein, who was raping little girls. And he was able to do this for decades, even though it was an open secret, as we now know from his 50th birthday book. We know that people were just joking about his, essentially trafficking in children. And the fact that he was never held accountable, maybe he would have been, but he wasn't for decades. And now other famous, powerful men in his circle who may or may not have been a part of this are also not being held accountable. I think it's just a really prominent example of what's happening every day behind the scenes, whether it's the music industry using NDAs, so non-disclosure agreements to silence the problem and settling lawsuits and paying out lots of money, or it's Hollywood doing that, or it's the tech industry, you name it. There are these powerful men in positions of authority who are covering up this issue, and they have for at least a century.
Yeah. I know you're not a psychologist, but it's an interesting dynamic to me about us men that, we attain a certain level of power. We get into a position where we want to expand that into doing whatever we want, whether it's women, whether it's, whatever. And I just, the old adage is that power corrupts, but I've always been curious as to find out why, our interaction with women is part of the corruption.
Well, there's been some interesting research lately by a PhD, Peggy Orenstein, who looks at what is happening with young people in rape. And I think it can be generalized across the age groups. And she finds that young men are actually pretty well aware of boundaries. They just don't believe that they have to respect it. And I think, young boys, especially those who are being indoctrinated through the manosphere, which is this, white supremacist, misogynistic space on the internet, many of them are getting the message that they can act with impunity, whether it's, engaging in acts of violence or engaging in sexual violence. And so at the end of the day, they know what they're doing is wrong. We know this from data. In fact, it's about 1 in 3 college men say they would rape if they knew they could get away with it, which is a startling statistic. At the end of the day, they don't feel as though they feel entitled, right, to women as bodies. And I think part of this is the fact that we objectify women. We normalize the objectification of women in our culture. We define women by what they look like aesthetically in their bodies, how appealing they are as sex objects. So it doesn't matter whatever else a woman accomplishes in her life. If she's not a valuable sex object, she will not have the value that she should in our culture. So we raise our little girls to believe their bodies are and their appearance are the most important things about them. And then we raise little boys to believe that, heterosexual little boys to believe that women exist for them. And so it's a terrible social recipe. And one we could shift tomorrow. All we would have to do is fully humanize women and stop objectifying them and turning them into sex objects and enforce this idea that men are not entitled to women's bodies without their permission and to women as bodies, as sex objects.
Yeah, I'm gonna change the subject because you scared me with that statistic. You said 1 out of 3?
1 out of 3 men would rape if they knew they would not get caught or punished.
And Peggy Orenstein, that was the woman that is she still with us as far as like on this side of the realm?
Sure is.
Because I'm gonna try to get her on the podcast so I can dive into that a little more. Thank you for that. Let's get back into the political thing, especially about feminism, because you have documented that there are 13 types of feminism. I want to focus on the TERFs. So explain to the listeners what that acronym means and what impact are they having in American politics.
So TERFs are trans-exclusionary radical feminists. They have very little influence in U.S. politics because they haven't taken hold here, but they have much more influence in UK politics. And TERFs are a very small but vocal strain of radical feminists who believe that transgender women should not be considered women, should not be allowed to use the same restrooms or be in the same domestic violence shelters or in the same prisons, as it were. And so it's essentially feminists who are engaging in anti-trans sentiment. It's been pretty roundly criticized by most feminists, although there are, a few kind of high profile women like, the Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling, who a lot of folks are now boycotting. But in the UK, they have been able to push legislation that essentially marginalizes trans people.
Yeah, because I know Theresa May, when she was the prime minister, she introduced something to try to address the transgender population, and Rowling and a whole bunch of other folks gave her a whole lot of grief and pushback on it. And I can't remember, did that get repealed or what the deal was, but I know she would fall in the category. What about, when I'm talking about Rowling, would fall in that category. What about Nancy Mace? Would she be considered a TERF?
Absolutely. In fact, she talks about being a survivor of sexual violence, and while she doesn't directly invoke calling herself a feminist, so maybe she's just anti-trans, but it's that same sort of sentiment. And you are absolutely right that Theresa May and the TERF lobby in the UK did rule that trans women are not women in the eyes of the law, which it will now be the basis for a lot of anti-trans legislation moving forward. But Nancy Mace is the exhibit A in anti-trans hatred in the United States. She uses slurs to describe to describe transgender folks. She routinely attempts to smear them as being perpetrators and criminals. And so, yeah, she embodies kind of the TERF ethic here in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, if you follow her career, you would think that she was a feminist in the sense that, she was the first woman to graduate from the Citadel. She's been very, very vocal about women's rights up until the transformation, whenever that happened. It was somewhere within the Trump first administration, whatever. But up until that point, she was considered like a champion. And then, of course, this revised version of her now that wants to be governor of South Carolina, now all of a sudden it's like she's got a problem with Representative McBride. And, and just, it was like the first 2-3 weeks of the session, it was all about her and her war against the transgender community. So I don't know. I just, when I saw that, I said, so Doc is kind of categorized her. And there's actually a group of women that kind of like feel that transgender women are a threat to women.
Whether or not, Eric, I'm here to report trans women are not a threat to women. Trans women are women. It's fascinating to me to see this sort of, to see the hatred and discrimination that feminism pushes against to then be weaponized by certain feminists. We're talking about folks who the trans community is really diverse, but I think we can all accept that gender is a performance. This is, it's a social construct. There are many folks who also, look at gender, sex, and sexuality, all three as being socially constructed, meaning that they don't exist in nature, but we decide what the rules are, and we've decided that they're binary and that they're natural and biological, which, no self-respecting biologist would embrace, right? We see these as social constructions. And so if gender is socially constructed, then why would feminists be so afraid of people who choose to construct their gender in ways that don't align with the binary? I find it to be kind of fascinating hypocrisy in the sense, not to get too theoretical, but the binary is what has driven much of patriarchy, meaning the rule of men, for so long. So I view transgender folks, whether intentional or not, as being on the front lines of challenging the binary, which I think is so crucial to, getting rid of our big system of power when it comes to gender, which is patriarchy.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, another name that always comes up, the Riley Gaines. I call her the biggest loser in American sports. You want to blame a transgender woman for your loss in a swim meet and you finished fifth. And really, if it wasn't for a tie, you would be sixth in that race. There were 4 other women that were way better than you, but you want to blame this one particular woman, and it just, yeah. So anyway, enough about that. Let me get into some other women I'm a little shaky about. Right? What category of feminism do Erica Kirk or Katie Miller fall under? Would they be considered like the modern day Phyllis Schlafly's?
Yeah, the sort of trad wife, and I think Erica Kirk, and certainly Stephen Miller's, like Katie Miller, right? Stephen Miller's spouse, and he's an open, like, white supremacist and very traditional gender role person. These trad wife and trad wife adjacent women are not feminists, right? If feminism, so whether we view feminism as the wanting the equality, political, social, and economic equality of the sexes, which is the kind of standard definition, or more bell hooks definition of feminism, which is getting rid of the power over oppression of all forms, including gender, neither Erica Kirk or Katie Miller would fit under the category of feminists. They are pushing for a very traditional, conventional way of approaching gender. So they're going back in time to the 1950s when the government was, promoting rigid gender roles in order to get women back in the home. And what we know is that, choice for women is great. And I think choice becomes really questionable when you have an entire social media ecosystem around trad wives that is promoting this idea that women should be in the home and in the domestic sphere only. I just find it to be, a kind of laughable throwback if it wasn't playing so well with young impressionable women and young impressionable men.
Do you think this? You can tell I'm kind of spitballing a little bit. Do you think this recent tragedy is going to have any kind of impact on this trad wife movement? Because now Erica is going to be out front, for at least the next year or two. And, now people are going on Katie Miller's podcast. I didn't even know she had one, but, people can make the argument about me too. But I'm just saying, it's like now it seems like these tragic events have kind of put them out there. And because they espouse these beliefs, do you think that there will be a bigger uptick in that mindset and, a counter to feminism that way? That's the reason why I asked, would you consider them modern Phyllis Schlafly's? Because as I was growing up, she was, the anti-ERA person, and she was able to build the American Eagle or whatever the name of her group was, that we're getting all these women to say, no, we don't want equal rights. And even when the Republicans were for equal rights, right, she was leading the charge against that. So I'm just wondering, are these young ladies about to take that mantle?
Eric, great question. Yeah, so Phyllis Schlafly, for folks who are not familiar, founded the Eagle Forum in 1972 to push back against the Equal Rights Amendment, which Alice Paul actually tried to propose as an amendment to the Constitution in 1923. After finally getting women the right to vote, after that big push, they immediately turned their sights to the Equal Rights Amendment, which is simply an amendment to the Constitution that says that women are fully covered in the Constitution. And for folks who are surprised that that's not in the Constitution, you should be. It leads to a lot of things happening that otherwise wouldn't if women were fully protected by the Constitution as a category. And so Phyllis Schlafly had all of the trappings of a modern businesswoman, in that she had an office and a staff and travel and an expense account. So she was living the life of a modern businesswoman while assailing that lifestyle and saying that women should be in the home. Her Eagle Forum was heavily funded by right-wing interests, religious interests, a lot of theocratic interests that were pushing this. And so she and her efforts were able to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment. And interesting that you're bringing up Katie Miller and Erica Kirk, both of whom have big platforms. But I think, Eric, you're pointing out they're going to have even bigger platforms, especially Erica Kirk in the tragic wake of her husband's death. And just to be clear, political violence is never the answer to anything, right? Charlie Kirk was, as much as I disagreed with him on pretty much everything he ever said, he was doing it right. He was going to college campuses and trying to convince people to his side. That's how you do politics. It's political persuasion. And now Erica Kirk will be likely taking up a lot of that work, which will give the trad wife trend a much bigger face, more playtime in mainstream channels, and reach more young women and young men and convince them that this is the way to be. I do think it's important to expose the fact that there are big donors, big religious and conservative donors, who are writing checks for tens of millions of dollars, or almost $100 million annually in the case of Turning Point USA, in order to just push an ideology. And we don't have something like that in the center. We don't have something like that on the left. It is a uniquely right-wing phenomenon where you have millionaires and billionaires getting together and writing big checks in order to have certain mouthpieces promote an ideology. And I have no doubt that Erica Kirk will be promoting the trad wife ideology. And of course, Stephen Miller's spouse, Katie Miller, has quite a big platform given her ties to her husband in the White House. And so already we see about 40% of evangelical and Protestant women are identifying as trad wives, and that's a number that is increasing. And so while we are seeing women make great gains in many places, we're seeing this absolute backlash and trying to get women back into the home, as we were in the 1950s.
Yeah. All right. So let me close out. Like I said, I wanted to talk to you about your connection with New Orleans. It's hard to believe. It has been 20 years since Hurricane Katrina. What do you think has been learned, and how has New Orleans changed? Because I know you were part of, the restoration of the city after Katrina with some of the projects you were doing. So I would like to have your assessment on where you think it is now. I know you're not living there at the moment, but I'm sure you still have ties and connections.
I'm back and forth to New Orleans and continue to do work in the city. And I was just there for Katrina 20, and it is hard to believe, as you point out, Eric, that it's been 20 years. Prior to Hurricane Katrina, I had not been to New Orleans because I was raised Pentecostal evangelical. And even though I kind of shed some of that, I still had this idea of New Orleans as like Sin City, right? And I just hadn't been there and thought of it as like a den of iniquity. And when Hurricane Katrina hit, I remember I was flying out to a conference in Washington, D.C., and on my way out, I was seeing images of my fellow Americans on their rooftops. And then 4 days later, as I was flying back home, I was seeing these same images of my neighbors, my fellow Americans up on their rooftops, stranded, starving, many having drowned. And I remember being on the flight in particular because there was a roast of Pamela Anderson. And I don't know if you remember this roast, but she was wearing a revealing outfit. And so I was walking back. It was a JetBlue flight, walking back from the restroom and seeing all of these JetBlue little TVs on the back of the seats tuned into the Pamela Anderson roast. And no one was looking at the images anymore. And it was so disturbing, not only that, fellow Americans were still stranded, but that we had kind of already moved on. And so when I got back home, I heeded a civilian call from celebrity Sean Penn, who said, yeah, come on down with your boats. And so I borrowed an SUV, an Xterra from a student, and hopped in with 2 other students, and we drove down, and of course couldn't fly in. There were no flights, there were no places to stay, and we had press passes. And it's one of those before and after moments where you think the world works a certain way, and then you see human beings who have died and are just lying in the streets. And it's many days, the week that the storm hit, we made it down, but many days after the storm had hit, and there still wasn't food, or rescue efforts hadn't really gotten fully underway. And then to learn that this was not only predicted with the Hurricane Pam simulation a year before, it was preventable. It wasn't an issue with, Hurricane Katrina hitting the city dead on. It was a Category 5 storm out in the Gulf. By the time it hit Waveland, Mississippi, which is where ground zero for Hurricane Katrina, it was a Category 3. New Orleans did not get a direct hit. It was just strong winds from a Category 2. And that caused the largest, what would later be called the largest engineering disaster in U.S. history, which is that the levees breached, right? And they breached in 3 primary places. And so most of my efforts and my colleagues' efforts have focused on the lower Ninth Ward. So we immediately did rebuilding and home gutting, which is just removing items from houses, and set up community kitchens and community lending stations in the lower Ninth Ward, and then opened the New Orleans Women's and Children's Shelter, and continued to work with Common Ground in rebuilding. And then about 5 years after Katrina, I realized it wasn't going to come back, that there wasn't going to be justice in rebuilding. And so we opened the Lower Ninth Ward Living Museum in order to preserve the history of that historic Black neighborhood, and then began curating the first civil rights museum in New Orleans with Dr. Leona Tate, who is one of the 4 little girls who desegregated the Deep South. I think a lot of people know about Ruby Bridges and her heroic efforts at Franz Elementary. What people may not know is that there were 3 little girls who were doing the exact same thing less than a mile away in the lower Ninth Ward. And of course, all the white parents pulled their kids out of school. They were terrorizing these little girls and harassing them. And so Dr. Tate was able to, many years later, purchase McDonough 19, which is the school she desegregated, and make it into preserve it as an historic landmark. She's reopened it with the exhibit that we curated, as well as mixed income housing for older adults and a gathering space for activists. So we do our annual gala. This year it's happening on November 14th. which is a Friday night. It's the best party in New Orleans, probably sold out already. But I hope that, anyone in New Orleans who might hear this will support the TEP Center, which is named after the last names of the 3 little girls who desegregated that. And we continue to, raise awareness about what happened, but also provide spaces for the community to come together, because it's especially the lower Ninth Ward, it's a part of our country that, was flooded because of injustice, because the levees weren't built right. They weren't built deeply enough after a breach that happened in 1965 with Hurricane Betsy. It simply wasn't built down far enough. And this is a neighborhood that was not allowed to come back in any equitable way. So if anyone's visiting New Orleans, please visit the TEP Center and give them their support.
All right. So thank you for that, Dr. Heldman. Yeah, and I was in Mississippi during that time. I was actually in the legislature during that time. So, you were dead on about Waveland being hit, and, our focus had to be trying to get us back, on the Gulf Coast going on. But we had a lot of people from New Orleans come in, and me and several other legislators just kind of took it upon ourselves to do the best we could to get them situated. And Jackson, Mississippi was a success story as far as people coming from New Orleans to reestablish. But when I saw that in your background, I said, well, I got to at least ask her. And so I'm glad to know that you're still engaged with what's going on down there. If people want to reach out to you, if people want to, other than enrolling at Occidental College, how can people do that?
My email is just my last name, Heldman, at oxy.edu. And my website is Dr. Caroline Heldman, and you can find me on the everything, the Blue Sky, TikTok, Instagram, sort of Twitter, but not an account on Twitter, just sitting there hanging out, and Facebook.
Well, Dr. Caroline Heldman, it's been really, really a pleasure and an honor to talk to you. And I greatly appreciate this opportunity to pick your brain a little bit. And do understand that one of the rules here is that once you've been invited and you accept it and you come on, that you have an open invitation to come back. And so you don't even have to wait for me to ask you. If you was like, Erik, I need to talk about something, you're more than welcome to. We'll make that happen. So Dr. Heldman, thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, it is my honor, Mr. Erik Fleming. You are marvelous, and thank you for your incredible work. And I look forward to coming back on.
All right. All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for my next guest, Alia Dastagir. Alia Dastagir is a former reporter for USA Today who frequently covers gender and mental health. She was one of 8 U.S. recipients of the prestigious Rosalind Carter Fellowships for Mental Health Journalism. She won a first-place National Headliner Award for a series on suicide and was the first winner of the American Association of Suicidology's Public Service Journalism Award. Dastagir has appeared on CNN, NPR, and C-SPAN to discuss her reporting. She is currently pursuing a MFA in creative writing at New York University, and her book, To Those Who Have Confused You to Be a Person, Words as Violence and Stories of Women's Resistance Online, was recently published by Crown. And we're going to talk about the book and a couple other subjects during the interview. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Alia Dastagir. All right, Alia Dastagir. How you doing, ma'am? You doing good?
I'm good. Thank you so much. And thanks for pronouncing my name correctly. I respond to so many things at this point, but I appreciate that. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm one of those folks too that it's like if I can cash the check at the bank, it's all good, right?
Exactly.
So look, I'm honored that you're on. We're going to talk about your book, but I also kind of want to touch on some things that's happening, in real time. And I think because of your background in journalism and all that, that I think you can handle some of the questions. The other thing is I kind of start the show off with a couple of icebreakers.
Oh, God.
But it's not that bad.
All right, let's go.
So the first icebreaker is a quote. To be heard as complaining is not to be heard.
Yeah.
To hear someone as complaining is an effective way of dismissing someone. You do not have to listen to the content of what she is saying if she is just complaining or always complaining. What does that quote mean to you?
I mean, that is a great quote by a scholar named Sarah Ahmed from her book Complaint. That quote, sometimes you read something or you hear something and you just feel like it is able to give language or crystallize an idea, like something that you feel is inherently true, but you don't kind of have the language for. And she writes so directly and so clearly, and I think was able to, articulate. She's not talking about necessarily online abuse, but abuses more broadly, especially in the workplace. But that quote really speaks to this sort of, the sort of reflex that we have to dismiss people, to dismiss legitimate emotions, whether it's, fear or anger, whatever, that when you're, that we have, I guess, sort of an obligation when we're sort of being in the human community together to make space, right? For the emotion, to give, I guess, kind of uptake, right? To the emotion. And we don't do that. We can't hear it. We can't hear each other. And so I think that this, because, I am obviously writing a book about women, or maybe it's not obvious to your audience, but I wrote a book about women and the harms and the violence that sort of women specifically face. I think that this is also, she's talking about something very gendered there, right? Which is, it is very easy to listen to somebody, to not hear somebody, right? To not hear a person if you, depending on kind of the way that you sort of, depending on who the speaker is, right? It gets very easy to give, I think in many cases, we give uptake or we give attention or we legitimize the emotions and the experiences of certain groups and not others. So, yeah, I mean, I think that quote for me is just so important to this issue of online abuse, because I think so many of the times when women experience online abuse or harm in these online spaces, they are told that they are complaining. They are told that they are too fragile or too weak or too overwrought, or their emotions are sort of, useless, right? In these spaces. And I think that that's just such an absurdity and such a shame. And it's one of the reasons why we haven't been able, I think, to meaningfully address the issue of online abuse, particularly when it's directed towards certain groups of people.
Yeah, the thing that came to my mind when I first read that quote was Chicken Little, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that, it's like when something actually did happen, it was like, well, Chicken Little, you've been saying the sky's been falling for a while. So, we're not going to buy into it until, okay, now that sky's actually falling, you actually meant it this time. Right. And I think, in the gist of what you're talking about with online abuse or just any kind of issue that people, because I mean, you can flip that with Black people, right? It's like they'll say, we're victimizing ourselves when we say there's an injustice here and an injustice there. And then when people finally see it, it's like, oh, okay, this is what you were talking about. But until that actually happens, it's like it's in one ear, out the other.
And Black people and Black, particularly Black digital feminists are such a huge part of this story too, because exactly to your point, right? Like these were, they were some of the, users online who were sort of loudest about this issue of online abuse and the weaponization of these platforms and the ability to spread maliciously disinformation on these platforms. I mean, they were prescient about this now, 15, 20 years ago, talking about this, and they were their insights were not taken seriously. Their pain was not deemed worthy of serious attention. And now we have, the moment that we're in, where these platforms are totally unaccountable. Disinformation has run rampant. I mean, the ability for certain people in this country to be able to speak freely is, under not even under threat, right? I mean, we can't. So it is so true, particularly, for certain groups of people. I think that's the whole point with that sort of quote, is that people there is something that needs to be heard, but certain people in the culture, right, are that their pain is not deemed worthy of serious attention. And so then we find ourselves in the position we're in.
Yeah. All right. So now the second icebreaker is what I call 20 questions.
Oh, God.
So I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
It's just a lower number, mean you're going to ask me fewer questions. All right. I'm going to go with 9.
Okay.
Because I was in the 9th month.
All right. Number 9. If you were required to be a single issue voter, what issue would you choose and why?
All right. Well, I guess I would have to say reproductive justice. I think bodily autonomy, human dignity. I mean, just bodily autonomy, right? I mean, just being able to, my identity as a woman. I mean, I have daughters. It feels to me one of the most horrific and brutal and devastating and dangerous sort of developments, right, in the last several years, which is to say that it is incredible to think that I have less rights and my daughters have less rights in some ways than my mother did. So, yeah, I would say that the reporting on what is happening around abortion in this country and what is happening to women and their inability, or people who, anybody, right, who can carry a pregnancy, is just, it's incredibly frightening. And I think that it intersects with so many other sort of human rights issues and bodily autonomy issues and human dignity issues. And so that's extremely important to me.
All right. Do you feel that survival from sexual harassment or sexual assault is a form of resistance?
Yes, I do. I think that, yes. Okay, so let me think. How do I formulate that? Yes, because I think that the things that make sexual violence possible and permissible in cultures are forces and systems that many of us are trying to sort of resist, right? So when you, and also I don't want to, make any kind of moral judgment around people who can't survive those things, right? Like it is, I mean, violence and harm and oppression can be incredibly destructive, and many people don't withstand it, right? Many people don't survive. And I don't want to sort of moralize around, whether or not that makes a person sort of stronger, more capable, more resilient. But I do think, yes, I think it is an act of resistance, because I think that the source of violence, this oppressive violence that I write about in the book, and that I think, you sort of, also explore in your program, I think the sources of that oppressive violence are, what make that kind of, that is what makes violence possible, right? Like a hierarchy or a system that ranks human life. And so when you survive, you are sort of sending a message to yourself and to the broader culture that you will not be, I don't know what, I don't want to sound trite, right? But you will not, that these things are, you're going to still continue, right? You're going to continue to move through. You deserve a life. You deserve dignity. You deserve safety. You deserve these things. And so, yes, I do think that it is a form of resistance.
So I want you to expound on it a little more in a specific sense as to why is it such a huge deal for the survivors of the Epstein trafficking ring to come forward? Oh,
God. Yeah. And watching them speak in those moments. I mean, I think because, the sexual violence is, again, we're talking about what makes it possible, what makes it permissible, what allows it to sort of, I don't know if flourish is the right word, to be so pervasive, right, in society, is because because we feel women feel and survivors and victims feel such shame about what happened to them. And it is such an incredibly intimate violation, thinking about to my single, if I was going to be a single issue voter, right? Like that issue of bodily autonomy. I mean, violations of the body are incredibly profound, and it takes so much to kind of make sense of that and to sort of extricate your own feeling of shame and responsibility from, this violence that has been perpetrated against you. And so I think that, I felt particularly moved watching the Epstein survivors speak at that press conference recently, because they also are putting themselves, not only are they resisting, right, this sort of culture of silence and resisting the shame, right, that the perpetrator is counting on them, right, banking on them feeling so deeply so that they won't speak, but they also are putting themselves at such enormous risk to speak out and again, thinking even about, again, my work, on this book is about, in many ways, what happened, what is the cost of speech? Like, what does it cost us to speak, and what happens to us when we speak, whether we're at a press conference or, posting something on X, right? What is the cost of that? And in many cases, speaking out about injustice makes you a greater target for injustice, and particularly when you're expressing sort of public vulnerability. So I think that, those survivors were just the act alone, and especially the content of what they were saying, which was effectively, if you're not going to hold people accountable, we are going to take matters into our own hands. We have the names. We know what happened. We're going to, it is, and they put themselves at enormous risk to do that. But there's a great recognition that in order to usher in the kind of world that so many of us want, our voices are our greatest, sort of tools, right? So yeah, I'm incredibly moved by that press conference.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about this book. To those who have confused you to be a person, how did you come about that title for the book?
Yes. So, and you said it correctly. So that was good. But I think that's sort of the point, right? That you sort of, I don't know. When I'm thinking about what I sort of, okay, well, let's just say it like this. It's so hard to write a book. I think it's even harder to name a book. Like, it was incredible. Like, everything I came up with, then then I had another title, and it ended up being a Taylor Swift song, and that was a big mess. So it's really, really hard to sort of distill something, right? That you are, in many ways, my book is trying to complicate something that I think that people feel that or not all people, but that many people feel that they understand, right? And I'm trying to sort of complicate it, to add nuance. And then when you're asked to sort of name something, to name a book or title something, even a news article, right? You're sort of being asked to come up with the simplest way of sort of saying, being able to communicate what is in these pages. And that's very difficult. But for me, the title was sort of born, I was looking for something that would really speak to the heart of the project. And the issue of online abuse was something I had been thinking about for years while I was sort of experiencing it and watching other women sort of speak out about it. But it wasn't until, I guess, like late 2019 or maybe early 2020, maybe late 2019, I started to think, okay, maybe I want to explore this in a deeper way. And then early 2020, I'd written a story, ironically, about online abuse of women journalists. And a user who was ostensibly male sent me a message after reading that story that said, "I'm sorry to those who have confused you to be a person, but you are not a person." And there were so many things to kind of unpack about that. So when I received that message, I had just had a baby, and I was breastfeeding the baby in her room. And there was just an extraordinary amount of dissonance between what I was experiencing in my body and with my child, and what was sort of visible, right, kind of in that room, right, and what was happening inside me, and what this what sort of cognitively right now, what was happening, and then what this person was sort of saying to me, which is you're not a person. And I had just, kind of helped make a person. And I was like keeping a person alive, like with my body. So there was such dissonance there. But I think the reason I titled the book, sort of drew from that to title the book is both because it was in that moment that I think if I recall correctly, that I really was resolved to write the book or to do something. I didn't know exactly what shape it would take, but that's when I decided that I would really do it. And I think it also that message and the sort of sentiment and the difficulty that I had with sort of processing it also sort of speaks to what I felt was something that was really important to kind of underscore in the work, which is that the message doesn't have to have like profanity or death threats or rape threats or be, sort of really sort of visibly kind of disgusting, for it to kind of call our attention to it or for it to matter or for it to cause harm, right? Some of the women that I interviewed for this book were most harmed by language that really you couldn't even report to a social media platform, right, for a violation of their rules. And so I think it speaks to the fact that we experience really a kind of spectrum of kind of abuses in these places. And this was an incredibly dehumanizing message, but there was nothing, explicitly kind of profane about it. And I think the final thing that I way that I think it speaks to the project is that I thought about that message for a long time because it was so grammatically awkward and sort of strange. And I think that that's sort of a missed piece of what these experiences can really be like for people, which is to say that it's really clear what somebody sending a rape threat or a death threat thinks, it's clear what that person thinks about you. But some of these messages really do take up so much more sort of time and labor in our sort of brains and bodies as we try to make sense of what is being said, why it's being said, and maybe whether or not we deserved it, which we don't. But I do think that that's a, sort of an impulse to be kind of like, what did I do? Like, what did I do that this person thinks that I don't belong in the human community? So yeah, that's where the title came from. And people do stumble on it. And I do have some self-consciousness about it sometimes. But I really do think it speaks to the heart of the project. And if it makes somebody kind of think, stop at a bookstore, then I've done my job.
So you mentioned that you interviewed a lot of people in compiling this book. And in the introduction, I tell people that you're a journalist and all that. So it seems natural for you to gather stories to put a book together. The question I have for you is, why did you make yourself vulnerable and put your story in the mix with all the others? Why did you feel you had to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's a great question because it is such a departure from what I'd been doing in my decade at USA Today, which is most of the time, really never. I think very occasionally, maybe one or two times I wrote in the first person. I think it had to do both with the genesis of the project and also with ultimately the goals. So initially I was just going to write about myself, but nobody wanted that book. And that's good because there was a real sort of narcissism, I think, involved in that and a kind of myopic idea about what the abuse was and what was driving it, because I was only initially kind of trying to speak from my own experience. And I so deeply misunderstood the problem. Even, just thinking about what we were talking about earlier with, some of these Black digital feminists who were online, for years and years and years being abused and speaking out about it and experiencing certainly, yes, some of what I experienced as a reporter at USA Today, but we're not necessarily part of an enormous institution that could stand behind them. We're experiencing not just sexism and misogyny, but racism and misogynoir and all these other kinds of things. So initially I was trying to write from my own experience, but that wasn't resonant when I was trying to kind of get this idea off the ground. And I feel very grateful for that because I think that it forced me to look at the issue in a deeper way and to look backwards and instead of being sort of really preoccupied with my sort of present experience. But I think that, one of the goals for the project ultimately was to really kind of try to slow down the experience of being harmed in these online spaces, right? Because I think sometimes when we talk about online abuse or online harassment, maybe our minds kind of flash to certain, language, right? Or certain words but I really wanted to explore, like, what does it mean to experience it? And not just in that moment, right? But to kind of carry it around with you, or to carry all of your life into the way that you process and experience that abuse. Because obviously we all sit in different places in the culture and have these very different lives and different resources. And, the women that I interviewed are very diverse in terms of race, class, occupation, all of these, disability status, all these kinds of sexual identity, all these kinds of things. And I think that that's really important because that all impacts how we experience this. But I felt like, I think that there was also there was always going to be a limit to how intimate I could get with these subjects, because it wasn't as if I was just following a single person, profiling a single person and could be with them for hours and hours and hours and be with them in their life and, go visit them wherever they lived. That wasn't the project. And so I felt that, I feel very grateful that these subjects really did let me into their suffering and their, the sort of, to the extent that they could, like the grappling that was going on for them internally and physically and physiologically as they were having these experiences. But my own experience, that I could speak about that with the most intimacy and the most authority, because I could say what that was like for me, what it was like to be in my body when I was breastfeeding my child and somebody said that I didn't belong in the human community, right? So I think it felt important and sort of additive, I hope, I guess only the readers can say, in terms of being able to achieve that kind of overarching goal for the project, which is to slow down and to more precisely and intimately go inside the person who is experiencing this kind of harm, and to really sort of show how it taxes a brain, a body, a life.
So which out of all those stories, which one resonated with you the most? Which one, impacted you the most?
Yeah. So that's a great question. They all, obviously, all of them feel like they were, I feel, this is an issue going back again to that quote in the beginning, my icebreaker question around the sort of notion of complaint, right? That if you hear somebody complaining, they cannot be heard. You cannot hear that person because you're not taking their pain or whatever the emotion is that they're trying to express seriously. You're not engaging seriously with that emotion. I think that it's very important to say that I feel an enormous amount of gratitude towards all the subjects, because it is not easy to talk about this publicly. I think particularly because there is a feeling in the culture that, like, this is just what happens online. Like, this is just what we're going to deal with, and we're stuck with it, and that sense of inevitability. And so what is the point? Like, what is the point of lamenting this if nothing is ever going to change, and this is the culture, and these are the norms? And I, fundamentally disagree with that. I think, we human beings built the internet, and we built language, and we, built systems, and we can change systems, and we can change the boundaries around all sorts of things. But I think that, all of the people that I interviewed were sort of speaking in spite of this attitude, I think, that is pretty pervasive, especially now also as, like, the conversation's changing. Now we're talking about AI and all these things. And even though that absolutely intersects with the issue of online abuse, I think there's a real sense that, like, I'm beating, beating a dead horse, right? Like, so I feel very grateful to every subject, because it's not easy to speak about this. It's not easy to speak about this honestly, especially when people are just going to accuse you of complaining and tell you that nothing's going to change. But I do think that because most of this book was written prior to the 2024 election, I have been now reflecting over the last, almost year, thinking about the book, thinking about the political moment we're in. And there is one story that I think about often because of just a single quote, just one thing that they said that, just those things stay with you. And it's in chapter 2 of the book. Each chapter sort of profiles a person who has experienced online abuse and then kind of uses that story to explore some sort of, larger issue, sociological, political, psychological, and then it kind of drills down to how that person coped with the experience. And in chapter 2, I profile a feminist comedian by the name of Maria Dakotas. And it was so interesting because she's a comedian, I think I had an idea in my mind of how that conversation was going to go. And I thought she would be very, I don't know. I thought we would discuss something serious, but there would be a lightheartedness to it. I don't know what I was thinking. It was there was no laughing. It was not funny. She was very disturbed by what happened to her, essentially in her roles of, in her work as a female comedian, she gets a ton of harassment online and off. And you sort of sometimes the same scholar who wrote that, that has that quote from that book, Complaint, Sarah Ahmed, also writes about this idea of the feminist snap, when you just can't take it anymore and you snap. And then the problem being that whatever you do when you snap becomes, it gets sort of pointed out as the problem rather than whatever the violence was that made you kind of snap in the first place. And so Maria had gotten basically a bunch of pictures from a male user, unsolicited, graphic pictures of this man's genitals, and decided to post it on Instagram and on X for different reasons. Some of it was related to safety. She was scared this person was going to find her and hurt her. And she was like, there was something about wanting to expose this person, this username, and get that out there. And also, she was so sick of it. She was so sick and tired of every time that she tries to make art, or that she does make art, or she shares art, that some guy comes in and, sends her a picture like this, or calls her a slur, or tells her that she's not funny. And not in that way, right? Obviously in a much more sort of terrible, brutal, and graphic way. But one of the things that she said to me that has stuck with me so much in the last year was that she says at one point to me that when we were talking about the antagonists and kind of why they do this, and that's not the focus of the book at all, but she was saying that, they want me to disappear. They want me to take it they want us to take it upon ourselves to disappear. And I think that notion of disappearing is just very much been on my mind, and I'm sure on other people's minds, whether it's, somebody who gets deported for writing something in a college newspaper, or, just everything that's going on with ICE right now, or people, just not only not being able to speak, but the consequences for speech, right? Being that we're gonna hide you away, and families can't even find you, right? There's so many things kind of happening here. But I think that idea of not only are you not going to be part of public or civic discourse, but you're going to disappear completely. And I think that's just a very scary and not sort of outsized fear, right? Kind of in a moment like this. So I think that quote really, and what she said just feels very prescient and very true, I guess, to the moment.
Yeah. All right. So I got a couple more questions. In chapter 7 of the book, you delve into the intersection of online harassment, misogyny, and white supremacy. Can you explain how these systems of oppression work together to shape women's experiences of online violence?
Yeah, so you want me to elaborate? Okay, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it was very important in this project to say really out the gate that we're not just talking about misogyny. That's just not what we're talking about. And I think that, so often And there's been research on this, particularly around Gamergate, which is now, over 10 years ago now. But that was a huge sort of cultural inflection point in our understanding of online abuse. And a lot of the mainstream coverage of that moment was very much around misogyny. And so when a lot of people were getting their first kind of real education on how toxic the internet is for women, it was very much a conversation about misogyny. And I think also about certain kinds of perpetration, right? So certain kinds of men coming for, in that case with Gamergate, it was mostly the victims that were most visible were white women. And so I think there has been a real sort of misunderstanding around what this is. And obviously now online abuse is a problem that sort of spans the ideological and political spectrum, right? But my book is very concerned with online abuse that perpetuates hierarchies, right? Hierarchies of power, online abuse that ranks human life. And so it was very important for me out the gate to try to offer, I guess, a corrective to that idea, right? Because again, if we think about some of the people who were, now, we see that Black women are disproportionately targeted for online abuse. I mean, there's stats all over the book, like about, Black female politicians, journalists experiencing, much higher rates of harassment than their white female counterparts. If we think about some of the people who were, I guess, the quote unquote canaries in the coal mine, are talking about this issue, long before it had entered, sort of mainstream consciousness. We're talking again about many Black women who were calling out the way that these platforms can be weaponized to spread disinformation and misinformation, which has had huge, huge, huge consequences for the political process, for the democratic, for the democratic experiment, right? Like, so I wanted to very early on say, yes, it's a problem of misogyny. But this is also an issue of white supremacy and all of the systems with which that intertwines, which is why I wrote a book about women, because that was the experience that I could speak to, again, with the most intimacy and authority. But this is a problem that, again, is disproportionately affecting certain groups of people online, marginalized people online, women, people of color, queer folks, trans folks, right? And so actually, chapter 1 profiles a young Black woman who had an experience of online abuse while she was studying dance at a predominantly white liberal arts college in the Northeast. And I think it was really important to use her experience to show that, the things that people were saying to her were, yes, of course they were sexist, but they were calling her the N-word. They weren't called, and the reason she was being called that was because she had experienced what she perceived to be sexist racism in her dance program, wrote an op-ed about it for her school newspaper, and then was abused by essentially the student body. And they were upset that she was a Black woman in a predominantly white space who was not following the rules for how, or the norms of behavior, right, around how Black people and particularly Black women are supposed to behave in those spaces in order to be safe, right, or to be respected, or to be able to be allowed in those spaces at all. And so I think it was very important in this project as a whole, but especially just kind of right out the gate, which is why I do profile this young Black woman in chapter 1 to sort of stress that, yes, this is misogyny, but this is so much bigger and more than that, which is why this is an issue that doesn't. This is why you write a book, right? Not just a story, because this is just such a huge issue that again sort of intersects with so many systems of oppression.
Yeah. So when people finish reading this book, what do you want them to take away from it?
Yeah. I mean, I actually read I was going to say one thing, and then I read somebody, a reader had written a review on Goodreads that said something positive about the book, but then at the end was kind of like, the solutions she writes about are kind of flimsy. Like she says, and I was like, that's kind of like, I'll take it, because the truth is that in many ways, the point of this book and what I wanted people to take away from this was really for them to feel very deeply, to deepen their understanding of the experience of the abuse. Like, that was the primary goal. And so, or to really validate the experience of the abuse for people who've been harmed in these spaces, and to see those stories, sort of part of, a much larger kind of narrative, right? But then you feel I think you do feel cynical and frustrated, at the end of something like that. And so I think I did feel like a compulsion to be like, okay, here are some things we can do. And and my book is not a book that delves very deeply into how we can, sort of break down, improve, reform the systems. There are other books about that. This book, I hope, will serve as, I think, to really give a language and a vocabulary to the experience. And then because I don't think you can agitate for, demand the reforms, unless you really feel like there is harm being created in these spaces that's worth addressing. And so maybe that's what I hope people will do. Will sort of walk away from the book with this idea. I hope they will walk away with the belief that this is not an acceptable way to live, that in the long run, we're not going to get to the kind of world, society that we sort of deserve if we allow abuse like this to flourish in these spaces. And so I guess that would be the hope, that people who've experienced it feel seen, that people who haven't experienced it can see more clearly what is happening in these spaces. And that ultimately it plants that seed of maybe doubt that these things are inevitable, that they are immutable, because I don't think that they are.
All right. So Alia Dastagir, thank you for coming on. I really, really enjoyed the discussion, and I can tell that we could go on for a long time if we were allowed to. The name of the book again is To Those Who Have Confused You to Be a Person. How can people get the book? How can people reach out to you? All that kind of stuff.
Yes. So I have a website, aliadastagir.com. You can send me a message there, reach out to me there. I recently left X. I feel very, very good about it. So I am on Blue Sky, but the best way to reach me is my website. The book you can hopefully buy anywhere books are sold, but I encourage you to visit your local bookstore or an indie bookstore or even a library. And if people read it and have thoughts about it, I would love to hear from them, all the things that they felt the book did well and all the things, the complexities that maybe escaped me. Would love to hear from folks.
Well, I told a couple of people that you were going to be on the podcast, and those people said, "Oh yeah, somebody told me to read that book." So the word is getting out there, and hopefully this will help continue to get the word out. But again, I just want to thank you for what you're doing, the work that you've done in the past dealing with mental illness and suicide prevention has been exemplary. And, maybe we can, one of the rules is that once you've been on, you have an open invitation to come back.
Oh, awesome.
So maybe, we come back, we might need to delve into that aspect of your expertise a little bit, but just keep doing what you're doing. And I'm glad that you took the time out of what you are doing to come on the podcast. I really, really greatly appreciate that.
Oh, Erica, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
All right, guys. And we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back, and we are blessed again with another appearance of the internet law firm known as Pearson Pearson. Yes, Dr. Tracy and Melba are back, and we're going to talk about some cases that's going to be coming up in the upcoming Supreme Court docket, which will start in October. Dr. Tracy Pearson is a legal, political, and cultural analyst and strategist who appears weekly on the popular and smart and entertaining radio program Tell Me Anything with Dr. John Fugelsang, which airs on Sirius XM Progress 127. And Melba is an attorney specializing in civil rights and criminal law with an emphasis on policy. She is the director of prosecution projects at the Gordon Institute for Public Policy and a co-manager for the Prosecutorial Performance Indicators Project based at Florida International University. And she just got some other kind of title distinction. I'll let her explain it when they come on. But ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have back on the internet law firm of Pearson and Pearson. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you wanted them and they're back. The law firm of Pearson and Pearson. Melba, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Eric. How are you?
Fine. I need you to explain your new title and stuff.
Oh, so I am the chair of the criminal justice section of the American Bar Association, which is the largest voluntary bar association in the United States. And my section, the criminal justice section, I am basically the leader of 14,000 attorneys who practice or are somehow connected to the criminal justice space. Of course, I'm speaking to you in my personal capacity, but this was an amazing honor, and I'm just thrilled to be able to be in this role, especially at this very pivotal time in our democracy.
Well, congratulations on that. Dr. Tracy, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I don't have any new titles. I'm still at Sirius XM as an analyst on Tell Me Everything with John Fugelsang. And we have a lot of everything to be told because of everything that's going on right now.
Yeah. Yeah. We were talking, ladies and gentlemen, we were talking off air about Jimmy Kimmel. And, I'm probably going to say a little something about that later on in the podcast, but I got the law firm on because the Supreme Court is convening in October. And I wanted to talk about a few cases that's going to be on the docket and of course have people smarter than me talk about it. So let's get right into it. I'm going to go in the order of which they're going to have the arguments. Okay. So the first one is going to be the Louisiana electoral districts. The courts will hear arguments for a second time in a dispute involving a Louisiana electoral map that raised the number of black majority U.S. congressional districts in the state. The court signaled on August 1st that it will assess the legality of a key component of the landmark Voting Rights Act, potentially giving its conservative majority a chance to gut a provision enacted 60 years ago that was intended to prevent racial discrimination in voting. Justices heard the arguments in the case on March 24th, but on June 27th ordered that the matter be argued again. State officials and civil rights groups have appealed a lower court's ruling that found the map laying out Louisiana's 6 U.S. House representative districts with 2 black majority districts up from 1 previously violated the Constitution's promise of equal protection. The arguments are scheduled for October 15th. So this is going to be the first one that's going to generate some news. So who wants to be the first one to talk about this one?
I mean, I can jump in super quick on this because voting rights is definitely something that's very close to my heart. I'm very concerned as to what this conservative majority is going to do because, first of all, the reason why we have the Voting Rights Act was because of the fact that people of color, specifically black people, were disenfranchised for so many years. And so when you have a state like Louisiana, which is pretty much a majority minority type of state where there is, large concentrations of African Americans, their vote should be able to count the same way as anyone else's. But the whole thing about gerrymandering is that you're basically drawing a map in all weird squiggles because you want to make sure that certain people are able to preserve power at the expense of others. So this map was redrawn to protect the incumbents who may or may not not be serving all communities equally. And so this is very dangerous in terms of people not having a voice and being able to truly pick who they want to represent them versus having representatives thrust upon them, which is completely contrary to everything we hold dear in democracy.
I couldn't have said that better. I totally agree. And it is a problematic case because we frankly, I don't know what this court ever is going to do generally. I mean, I've seen weird things come out of it, and I hate to say the word weird time because that's not an accurate statement. You know, we see how much the White House is putting pressure on institutions and private industry in ways that, frankly, in my lifetime, I have never even conceived of. And it's working to a degree. So it's frightening because, you know, being a lawyer, being somebody who used to respect the Supreme Court, I really am somewhat perplexed as to how they're going to handle this. And that's in relation to another issue that's coming up, which I don't know if we're going to ever get to on this episode, but because it's going to contradict things they've actually done. But in particular, this situation is an example of the weaponization of process, because the court said, add this extra district, and they appealed, and they're saying that violates the Constitution because it's based on race. And so it's really one of these situations where, you know, they're handing this conservative court on a platter something that they can crush.
Absolutely.
And that can't work. That can't stand, because we all have a right to have our vote counted and counted equally. And when you're doing that sort of gerrymandering to try to disenfranchise people who are already disenfranchised in so many ways, it is unconscionable that the court system would be participants in that.
See, and this is just a political person speaking. I think the court's going to approve a map with 2 black congressional districts, because since the voting rights people in Louisiana were not happy with the map, and you know the Republicans are not happy with the map, the Supreme Court's going to find out a legal way to piss both of them off and just approve a map that's got 2. Just from the trend I'm watching with this court, if it's a way for them to come across and saying, see, we're not totally racist. See, we're not totally insensitive to the Voting Rights Act. We're allowing an increase in representation, right? Knowing that both sides are not happy, I think they're gonna, you know, I don't know what it was that made them decide they wanted to hear it again, but that's just, I think they're gonna be contrary. That's the best non-legal term I can use.
I don't know, because one thing has been for sure in these last, and I still can't believe it's only really been like 8 months, but in the last 8 months, the one thing is for sure is that they are retreating from all the things that we could rely on them for. So the Supreme Court, the federal courts generally, but the Supreme Court especially, were always that place of respite for marginalized communities and being like, listen, this is in violation of the 1st, the 14th, the 5th, the 6th, whichever amendment you want to pick. And usually the Supreme Court will be the ones to give that relief. Now we're not seeing that. And since they have a lifetime appointment, to use the colloquialism, who's going to check me, boo? Right? Like who? They literally can execute the Project 2025 plan without any hindrance. So I feel like this might be the death knell for the Voting Rights Act. The same way that we've seen it. But the same way we've seen it in, Citizens United and some of these other cases where they're gutting provisions that were put in place ages ago to protect people. They're gutting all that now. So I'm less hopeful. But Tracy, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think one of the things that we think about, and I think that we just do it intuitively as attorneys, is we understand a question presented. And when it goes up to the Supreme Court, there's a question or questions presented to the court that they have to answer. And so the type of analysis you're talking about, Eric, is something that the district court would contrive of. But the Supreme Court either creates their own question, as we've seen, or they have, and it's the traditional way of doing it, is that you give a question presented for them to answer and try to hem it in. And so the question presented is, did Louisiana's remedial congressional map, which created a second majority black district after the old map was struck down, comply with the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or did it cross the line into unconstitutional racial gerrymandering under the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment? So what they have done is they have flipped this, and they have weaponized the Voting Rights Act and the concept of racial gerrymandering as if to protect white votes, not what was intended under the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah. Yeah. The old switcheroo. Just a fun fact before we go to the next one. The first person that was charged with racial bias under the Voting Rights Act was a black man in Mississippi, just so y'all understand.
There you go.
All right. So the next case is considered a death row inmate. The court on June 6th decided to hear an appeal by Alabama officials of a judicial decision that a man convicted of a 1997 murder is intellectually disabled, a finding that spared him from the death penalty as they press ahead with the Republican-governed state's bid to execute him. A lower court ruled that Joseph Clifton Smith is intellectually disabled based on its analysis of his IQ test scores and expert testimony. Under a 2002 Supreme Court precedent, executing an intellectually disabled person violates the Constitution's Eighth Amendment, barring cruel and unusual punishment. The arguments are scheduled for November 4th, Election Day. Okay. Dr. Tracy, you want to jump on that one first?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. So the 2002 decision was sort of the basis, the base. And then there were some refinements that happened along the way. And there was a 2014 case that dealt with Florida striking down rigid IQ tests. There was other cases that said that Texas couldn't rely on outdated stereotypes or any layperson opinions or concepts about individuals who may fit into this category. And so there was a lot of cases that came after Atkins. But where this is that the IQ test matters, and it has what is called an error rate. And it is designed, these tests are not cut and dry. They have an error rate to them because of how they are given, how they are scored, et cetera, and so on. I mean, I could talk for hours on this. I have a doctorate in education, but the crux of it is that it has a plus or minus 5-point error rate. And the issue here is, is this fuzz factor that you might consider, sort of think of it as a fuzz factor? Is that in accordance with their law? Is it considered to be, cruel and unusual punishment? And can you stop the state from doing what it wants to do under their own laws under these circumstances? And so, you've got somebody's life on the line. All right. I occupy this space. Somebody's life is on the line. I absolutely am opposed to the death penalty. I think it's absolutely aberrant and deplorable. That aside, when you have someone's life on the line, are we really going to fight about this issue? Are we really going to fight about this fuzz factor? Are we really going to fight about these error rates, which are real? You've got somebody who may, in fact, he has been adjudged as not having basically the cognitive reasoning skills that would be necessary to make that punishment, which is the severest punishment, appropriate under the circumstances. And I just, these cases make me absolutely insane because it's a human being. I mean, I never understand the concept of, let's say you kill somebody, so we'll kill you. Oh, what the heck is wrong with people? Like, I just don't sit in that space. And so, but at the core of it is, what kind of factors can they take into consideration? And, as if people are robots, as if tests are perfect.
Yeah, Mel,
And
go ahead.
I was going to say, just to piggyback on that, I mean, here's the margin of error we're talking about. So the person in this case scored 72. The cutoff is 70 in the state of Alabama to be deemed to be intellectually disabled. So the plaintiff here, the person involved, 3, 2, 1. The person involved here scored 72, and the judge found that with the margin of error, it could be considered a 69. But even with that being said, he took into consideration the totality of this person's circumstances of, their upbringing, of their lack of education, of, exposure to abuse, things like that. And so he's like, you know what? I'm going to err on the side of this person being intellectually disabled. And as such, this person should not be put to death. But it's so interesting to see this bloodlust that you're so like, oh my gosh, like we just gotta fry everybody, right? Like that seems to be the mindset versus, okay, like benefit of the doubt, let's deem this person intellectually disabled, because the alternative is the person's spending their life in prison. So it's not like the question is, do we execute them or do they get out, right? The question is, do they spend life in prison or are they executed? Either way, they're not going to be part of the community. If there's a worry about recidivism or are other people going to be harmed, that's not an issue other than in the prison context. And there's protocols for dealing with that as well. So if your whole thing is about making sure the community's safe, well, the community's safe. So is executing this person who in all likelihood is intellectually disabled, who is that truly serving other than a governmental bloodlust?
Well, the truth of the matter is that, this is not a big secret for anybody that's new my political career. I introduced bills to eliminate the death penalty in the state of Mississippi. And the argument was that, one, it's actually more cost effective to have that person spend the rest of the time in jail than it is to go through all these different appeals and all that stuff in a short period of time. The money that's spent on the litigation piece actually costs more than just giving this person, 3 meals and a cot for the rest of their life. And then the other piece is it's not a deterrent. If it was a true deterrent, then people would have stopped murdering folks a long time ago. It is not a deterrent. So that's a fallacy. And so, but to me, it's just, the first thing I think about when we have cases like this is of Mice and Men. And I don't know if y'all remember that book or not, but it was pretty clear that and I forget the character's name now. It's been that long ago, but the kid, the big kid didn't know what he was doing. All he wanted to do was play with his rabbit. You know what I'm saying? And he ended up killing a human being. And it's like, so we want to execute that person? I mean, that's, like you said, I don't understand the bloodlust. I don't understand the desire, but anyway, that's my soapbox. Go ahead.
Well, and to delve into the politics behind it is I sit here right now and I think, the level of contradiction that is going on right now, I struggle to process it. You're trying to execute somebody down in Alabama. We all agree, more expensive death penalty, less expensive life in prison. And people can't wrap their heads around that sometimes. And so, and you all want to save money and you're all about smaller government. You're all about doing, things for cheap and cutting services from people so that you can save money. I don't know. Are you giving my tax money back? But that aside is you're going to spend more money. It's not going to provide any peace to the family that suffered the loss. There is no closure when you lose a family member. And, oftentimes these folks are like, yeah, I just want this to stop. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are. In fact, they should fry, but it never brings the family peace. It destroys another family or other family members on the other side. And, you know, in some of these places, they go I think it's in Texas, they go pick up somebody off who's willing to volunteer to go do the execution, to press the button or whatever it is that they have to do behind the curtain. And, they pay them like $50 or something. I mean, it's historically, it's just we used this word earlier, but it's vile. It's a vile process that is so contradictory to what these people say. Rachel Maddow says, watch what they do, not what they say. And it is really that. It is, you're spending all of this money to kill somebody. Are you okay? Like, what is wrong with you? And so that's where I am from trying to make sense of it. Because I know folks out there are trying to make sense of things right now. They really are just reeling. We are reeling as a nation, as individuals, trying to make sense of everything that's happening. And it's happening federally and it's happening locally in your states. And this is an example of that.
All right. So
elections have consequences.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I want to say I was going to go to that one, but I'm going to go to the tariffs now. Okay. All right. So the court on September 9th agreed to decide the legality of Trump's sweeping global tariffs, setting up a major test of one of his boldest assertions of executive power. This has been central to his economic and trade agenda. It took up the Justice Department's appeal of a lower court's ruling that Trump overstepped his authority in imposing most of his tariffs under a federal law meant for emergencies. The case implicates trillions of dollars in customs duties over the next decade. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in Washington ruled that Trump overreached in invoking a 1977 law known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs. That ruling came in challenges by 5 small businesses in 12 U.S. states. The arguments also will include a separate challenge brought by a toy company. And there's no set date for that. They just said the first week in November for those arguments. Who wants to start on that one?
I'd be happy to rant about that for a minute. Okay, I actually drew a little drawing, and it's probably out on Blue Sky of like, if somebody could just put this in front of his face, this might help. And it was like stick figures. And we pay the tariffs. Okay, we pay the tariffs. And so the prices go up. So let's just put that aside. But so basically it comes down to whether Congress has delegated their authority to tax, because tariffs are a tax, whether Congress has delegated their authority to tax to the president through this particular statute, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And the courts have said, no, that hasn't happened. And I want to call everybody's attention to, there were some cases last term about, I think it was the Environmental Protection Agency, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, about how they were very, very specific in this particular statute that Congress had not delegated its authority to do certain things. It had to do with rulemaking. And so in this situation, the real issue is, has Congress not in practical terms, okay, not like, I don't know, the Republicans don't care, but in actual terms, have they delegated their actual constitutional authority to tax? Because there's an issue having to do with major questions. And there's this major question concept out there, which is that when it's a major question, if is the justification for the behavior, so the justification for these tariffs, so ambiguous and vague that it doesn't exceed or stop the authority that exists in other areas of law. So it doesn't overcome the statutory requirements and details in that statute. And so that's what this court is going to have to decide. And I think that, it's pretty darn clear that Congress is the purse. At least that's what I learned in elementary school. Maybe it's changed. And that, he can't just willy-nilly write these stupid, I'm trying not to curse here. I can curse on Sirius XM really fiercely. He can write these really silly, stupid, guppy-ish sort of executive orders that are not the kind of law that is enduring and effective. And just change whole swaths of how we operate. You can't modify the Constitution with your pen, Mr. President. It takes a whole lot of effort to do that. And so his whole effort of being a, quote, strong man who is very weak with these tariffs and imposing his will on other people and other nations, you've got some guardrails. And the Supreme Court's going to have to decide whether they've got the cojones to say, no, Mr. President, you can't do that.
And the sad part is they should be able to, because again, it's a lifetime appointment. And that's why the justices on the Supreme Court have a lifetime appointment, to insulate them from politics, from agendas, from administrations. So they need to use that power wisely and accordingly. Let's see what happens. But my thing is here, what's the emergency? Because this is under the Emergency Powers Act. What's the emergency? We weren't at war. We weren't in the middle of a famine. There wasn't pestilence like we were going through Revelations, so, like locusts, So there was no.
There's some that work in the White House, but no.
But what emergency justifies putting in place 50% tariffs, 25% tariffs, starting trade wars? Like, I understand the political, okay, maybe, you want to leverage something so you can get better, rates or whatever. Okay, fine. Like, I get that as a general premise. But an emergency power means like there's literally a problem and it's only for a short amount of time. So once the emergency passes, then the power goes back to whoever it's designated, in this case, Congress. So in my opinion, there was never an emergency. But even if you said there was an emergency, 8 months later, it's not still an emergency, right? Or whatever, 3 months, 4 months later, right? It's not still, there's no emergency that's pending that would have required that. So there's that. And then secondly, we just have to look at the whole separation of powers. You've got the executive, you've got the legislative, and you've got the judiciary, right? And three very separate branches of power who operate as checks and balances on each other. And if you have a situation where the president is overreaching and putting his hands into that of the legislative branch or that of the judiciary branch, well, that negates that whole concept of checks and balances. So again, are we a country with separation of powers as set forth by the Constitution and, 250 years of precedent? Or are we about to abandon that and become a whole different country altogether?
And on top of that, this is why I love talking about the U.S. Supreme Court and these issues, but simultaneously, I'm a trial lawyer at heart. And so trial lawyers are, it's sort of jungle rules out here. We can make all sorts of arguments. And one of the things that just keeps ringing in my head like a red blinking light is, dude, you made agreements with many of these people in your last term. What are you doing? Like you made these agreements and now you're just like, oh no, now this is terrible. And it's like, well, okay, then you're terrible. Great. We both agree on that. But this is just outrageous that, the prices have gone up so massively. And in fact, I bought something the other day and the invoice accounted for the tariff. Mm-hmm. It put a line in for the tariff. If every freaking company out there right now changed their pricing, signs, say in the grocery store. Okay. So the price of your cereal is X. The tariff is this, and this is what you're actually paying for it. Oh, we would see a response.
Well, Amazon tried to do that. And the president called him. I talked to my good buddy, Jeff Bezos, and, we're not going to do that. That was just, and then Jeff Bezos comes out. Oh, that just something was an internal discussion. It really, and everybody gets on their back and wiggles, like, come scratch my belly. And they just capitulate. And again, it's sad because it would have really broken out and hit home with people how much more they're spending, because maybe you don't remember how much eggs were when you went to the grocery 2 weeks ago, right? And you don't really have that frame of reference, but you're like, dang, everything just kind of feels higher. But when you have that line item where it's like these flip-flops are $10, and because they're coming from China, $5 for the tariff, so now your flip-flops are now $15. Now people understand that this wasn't just some political talking point. This has real impact in your life, and nobody else is paying the tariff except for you, us, all of us.
If the Supreme Court allows this to happen, what the retailers are going to do is they're going to have these sales. They may even try to say, a line item or whatever, but they're going to have a sale saying, oh, we're going to have a tariff discount if you sign up for this email or whatever. Then it's just a game. And then the whole deal with the manipulation of these tariffs, he's trying to make money. That's all this is for him, is a grift in the stock market. You just watch how the stock market reacts to how he's pushing tariffs and pulling them back. It's all manipulation to him. The only emergency is he's still broke in his mind and he's trying to get more money. That's the only emergency I see. But again, let's move on, because I want to get to this one. And this particular case, it's fun for me. It's a serious case, but it's fun for me because it deals with religion. Right. Mm. And it just, as somebody that has worked in the correctional system, it's always this, oh, really? So we got to do this, we got to do that. So this case, the justices on June 23rd took up a Rastafarian man's bid to sue state prison officials in Louisiana after guards held him down and shaved him bald in violation of his religious beliefs. Damon Landor, whose religion requires him to let his hair grow, appealed a lower court's decision to throw out his lawsuit brought under a U.S. law that protects religious infringement by state and local governments. The lower court found that this law did not permit Landor to sue individual officials for monetary damages. The law at issue protects the religious rights of people confined to institutions such as prisons and jails. And the arguments are scheduled for November the 10th. So, Melba, you want to take the lead on this one?
Oh, you already know because while I don't identify as a Rasta, I do wear locks and there's a lot from the Rastafarian culture that resonates with me. So, and then of course, as someone who's worked for the, American Civil Liberties Union, this is because this is textbook First Amendment, the freedom of religion. And that the government shall make no law abridging that the freedom to practice your religion. And so, there's no safety issue here. The gentleman involved in this case this was his third correctional facility where this happened to him. The first two, he actually had a copy of the ruling in his hand being like, hey, this is part of my religion. Here's the law around that. And the first two were like, cool, do your thing. He literally had 3 weeks left on his sentence. And he goes to this third facility, and that's where he's degraded. Because that's what it is. It's degraded. He was violated. He was physically violated. I can't even imagine. It's almost like biblical when you're thinking, just kind of just being held down and being violated in that way. And just like, your crown has been stripped from you. And that's literally what it is from that context. So I just, I'm heartbroken for him, number one. And, the fact of the matter is the same way we have these battles over making sure people who are of the Muslim or Jewish faith, get kosher meals or halal meals while in prison, not trying to give pork to somebody who, again, that's against their religion, but the guards are doing it because it's entertainment for them, right? It's about making sure that, number one, people's rights are still preserved in the correctional system. But number two, again, what does the First Amendment look like in 2025? Because we're already seeing attacks on freedom of speech and not ending well, right? So if we're crossing off freedom of speech, no, we don't need that anymore. Freedom of the press, we don't need that anymore. Now we're going to attack freedom of religion. So basically, we're just going to rip up the First Amendment. Better yet, just rip up the whole Constitution. Because if you can't get the first one right, if you can't get the rights under the First Amendment right, the rest of the Constitution is going to fall away the same way. So that's where my mind goes to. And again, my heart is just broken for him because to me, it's the same level of degradation than if you took a Muslim woman and who wore a head covering and ripped it off in front of a group of men. it's the same level of degradation where you're just like, basically in your mind naked and just your sense of security, your sense of identity has been ripped from you in the most violent way possible.
Yeah. And that, Dr. Tracy, before you respond to that, let me just say, and this is, maybe I'm reading it wrong, but it seems like the issue was not that the fact that his rights were violated is the issue. It's the fact that they don't want him to be able to go after the guards who cut his hair off.
But to me, the two are agreed, but to me, the two are still interrelated. Because the slippery slope is as follows. If you're like, well, you can't get any kind of restitution or any kind of closure for your religious rights being violated, then that empowers bad actors to keep doing this over and over again because there's no accountability. And then that in turn abridges people's rights to be able to practice their religion freely. So to me, it all, even though the surface issue is about who they can sue, the underlying issue, no matter how you cut it, is what First Amendment is going to look like in America.
Yes. I mean, it's a religious case. And it's a First Amendment case. Absolutely. But anybody who is listening to this podcast, I want you to imagine somebody shaving your head against your will. Just sit there and imagine what that might feel like and how, what action you might want to take. And especially if you didn't have any power or agency in the situation, like, you can't fight back, you can't hit them, you can't get out of the building. Just sit there with that feeling for a second. And so, yes, the issue here is whether this plaintiff can obtain money damages against the individual people who were employees of the government who did this. And it goes to a law that exists, which is the Religious Land Use and Institutional Persons Act of 2000. And what Congress said in that law is that no, there are no money damages available. And it has to do with whether a government is able to receive federal money. You must do this. In other words, respect religion, let's say. And if you don't, then you can't have federal funds to go help, let's say, build your prisons. And so that's what this case at its core in front of the court at the issue presented is dealing with. How and I want people to think about this from the perspective of, look, if you're employed for a company, that company indemnifies you. In California, there's actually a statute that says you are indemnified for any actions by your employer. So if somebody sues you, the company has to indemnify you. And in this situation, when it comes to these circumstances, Congress said, we're not paying money damages to people who have this issue. This is about us trying to enforce religious freedoms, okay, religious liberties. And they didn't mean this religious liberty. And so I think that one of the things that I would love to see, and this is sort of a side note, is that I would love whoever's going to be the next president, besides restoring all of the norms, I would love for somebody, I don't know why this hasn't happened, and maybe you can help with this with the ABA, is that I would love to see somebody go through every single statute that we have and find the gaps that exist, that because these things are made, it's like watching Post-its get slapped up on a wall, and it's just like, ooh, new policy, slap up a Post-it, boop, another new one, and they're all on top of each other, and they don't really work together a lot of the time. And they're written by people who at least these days, aren't actual attorneys. Back in the day, the folks that were writing stuff were actual lawyers, and things were written a little bit better, I dare say. But in this situation, what we're dealing with is exactly this, whether this person is entitled to damages, money damages, whether, like you sue and it's a separate issue, but you sue your employer for bad conduct. The way they make you whole is to pay you. Either the jury orders it, the arbitrator orders it, or you come to a settlement. This person doesn't have that right according to the decisions that have been made. And we need to find out what the final answer to that is.
Yeah. And I think that, the reason why I say it's a fun case, because these are the kind of cases that made me want to be a lawyer, and especially a constitutional lawyer, because I think in order to make sure that people are truly, truly protected, that you have to have a certain, I don't know, vigor, a certain passion. And I just want to see the arguments. This is the one I really wanted, like, who's representing Mr. Landor. I want to see how vicious they go at it and I shouldn't say vicious, but going up against this court, maybe that's the appropriate term, but how they go after it and how you're going to respond to Alito and Thomas and Gorsuch and Barrett, and how they're going to try to justify saying that this man shouldn't get compensated for that and that law should be upheld. That's the reason why I said kind of save this one for last, because I think this one is going to be the actual one where if it is an ACLU attorney or somebody of that ilk, I think this would be a fun case to watch. We may not like the result, but I think I think it's going to generate some interest. And I don't know, but maybe that's the nerd in me. I don't know.
No, I think there's also there's a parallel to this, which is there's another case that's going to be coming down the line here, which is that Pete Hegseth has issued a memo that has said that service members who do not shave their face and keep their face cleanly shaven are going to be discharged from the service in a year. You have a year to resolve this problem. And this disproportionately impacts Black men because the way the curl pattern works with the hair on their face. And so there was a ban a long time ago. The ban got lifted and they were allowed to we're not talking ZZ Top beards here. Okay. We're talking about managing a condition in their face that causes pain and infection and whatnot. And so Pete Hegseth has decided that the most appropriate way to deal with this and to continue his war on marginalized groups, including Black people and people of color, is to, force you to shave your face. And if you can't fix that problem, which is a condition of your body that does not impact your ability to do your job, by the way, and it is not narrowly tailored. So it's not people in the theater. It's people who, anybody, if you're sitting at a desk in Iowa, if you can't shave your face, you're out in a year. And so, I hope that these things are all going to come, in a mad rush, and so that we can actually see it, because it gets dripped out over time. We see this case and then in the future, we'll see another case. This stuff needs to stay in the public consciousness because this is a war on anybody who is not white.
And don't forget our, Muslim brothers who may keep their beard as part of their religion, right? And we're back to religious freedom. And so again, I mean, there was a similar case, I want to say, here in South Florida, where a police officer ended up either losing his job or something along those lines because he was Muslim and he didn't want to shave his beard. And apparently that ran afoul of some of the, whatever requirements or whatever they had within the department, and he was victorious. So, there is precedent there in terms of if this is part of your religious identity and it's not interfering with your job or anything like that, can the government tell you again that you can't exercise your religion? First Amendment.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, look, I'm gonna have to let y'all go. I'm not gonna do any predictions about these cases, because I think it was Dr. Tracy said we don't know what these folks gonna do. We ain't got no clue. But I greatly appreciate, and I say this every time, but I greatly appreciate y'all's incredible knowledge and able to dissect what's happening and explain to the listeners what's going on. So I would say that this is another successful meeting of the Pearson Pearson law firm. And I greatly appreciate y'all's time for coming on and doing this.
Thank you so much for having us as always, Erik. You're the best.
Erik, we love talking to your listeners and to you. And this is probably one of my favorite podcast conversations that I have. And so I'm grateful that you have us both on here. And I absolutely love talking with you, Melba, and having these idea generation sessions. They're just
yes. Same.
All right, guys, we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So let me try to close this out quickly, but I do want to thank Dr. Caroline Heldman and Alia Dastagir for coming on. Please get Alia's book and, and do what you can to support her and her work, as well as Dr. Heldman. She's going to be somebody, she's been around for a while. And, as you listen to the interview, if you're in Los Angeles or New Orleans, you know all about her. And like I said, both of these ladies have been on CNN and all that. So, again, it's always cool to get people like that to come on the show and really stress the theme about survival is resistance, right? And then, as always, to have my good friends Melba Pearson and Dr. Tracy Pearson to come on and do an installment of Pearson and Pearson. It's really, really a blessing to have two very astute attorneys, despite our crazy schedules, to be able to come together and make that possible. And hopefully that's, those segments are very educational for you all to understand what's happening. I mean, we could talk for a long time about cases before the Supreme Court and other legal stuff that's going on. And, some of our conversations offline are incredible too. So again, I just want to thank everybody that participated in this episode for doing so. So another hellified week in the news. We're still dealing with the blowback from the murder of Charlie Kirk. And, people are getting fired from their jobs. Their shows are getting canceled. The vice president and Stephen Miller have decided to go after every liberal in America. They want to put us all in jail or whatever, want us all unemployed and all that stuff. Although they might want to talk to the president because he got his wish. He got his wish. The Fed decided to lower the interest rates, but one of the reasons why they lowered it is because black folks are not getting hired, right? So if you go after the liberals, gentlemen, if you want us all to be unemployed, that's not going to help with the numbers the president's trying to boast about in the economy. So just keep that in mind as the witch hunt is going on. And then, of course, you hear the disturbing news from Mississippi, DeMartravian Reed, young man who was found hanging in a tree on the campus of Delta State University. For those of y'all who are not from Mississippi, Delta State is in Cleveland, Mississippi. It's in the Delta, Mississippi Delta region. It's one of two state universities up there. The other one is Mississippi Valley State. And if you've been a follower of the podcast, you might have heard me mention my fondness for Delta State because of their mascot, the Fighting Okra. Although they're officially called the Statesmen, those of us from around those parts know them as the Fighting Okra. And, my family, a good bit of my family is from the area near Cleveland, Mount Bayou to be specific. So I'm very familiar with the campus and very familiar with, I was very familiar with the student body and, and just the town and all that kind of stuff, Bolivar County. And it's shocking to hear it anywhere, but it's really shocking to hear it there and at that institution. Right now, the police still haven't figured out what exactly happened. Some people are trying to say don't jump the gun and say it's a lynching and all that stuff. But it's shattering to the student body. It's shattering to the community. It's shattering to those of us who are Black in America that that imagery is still there. Can you just imagine the police officers that had to respond to that, or the students that saw that, right? And then the Reed family, my condolences are out to them. It's bad enough to lose a child. It's bad enough. It's even worse to lose a child in that fashion. So, that's something that I had to deal with along with other members of the Black Caucus. When I was in the legislature, we had a situation in Southwest Mississippi. And it turned out the young man who died in that situation was a distant relative of Emmett Till. So, that wasn't, and, eventually that was ruled a suicide instead of a homicide, which a lot of people to this day, some 20 plus odd years later, still are not convinced it wasn't a lynching. Because there were a lot of factors in that story that just didn't make sense why he would take his own life, right? But yeah, and that's a whole nother episode I could do on that. And, some people do these podcasts about, stories, crime investigations, all that. That might be worth a podcast worth doing, all the stuff that led up to that incident 20 some odd years ago, excuse me. But yeah, just terrible news. So, in summation, we're in a bad place, and I don't have the time to delve into it. So maybe next week, looking at, who's scheduled and all that, I might go into a little more about something that has a religious connotation to what we're going through now, at least from my religious perspective. And so I'll dive into that a little more. But in short, if it was, I'll just say this. If what happened to the young man at Delta State, Mr. Reed, was related to this Charlie Kirk thing, just like we're seeing the accusations about rhetoric from the left or liberals or Democrats, and, the witch hunt and the ripping of garments and the beating of chest of the conservatives and the MAGA folks, right? I think at some point in time, people need to have a soul searching moment, and let's deal with the facts that we know. We know that one person shot Charlie Kirk from 142 feet away. That person's been arrested. That person has confessed to everybody but the police that he did it. And so let's focus in on who he is and why he did what he did. We may not find that out till the trial, right? So that might be a year or so away. So until that moment, I would advise people to just kind of stay focused on governing, right? I have an opinion. Everybody else that's got a podcast has an opinion. People that have talk shows have opinions. People that are guests on talk shows will have opinions, yada, yada, yada. And that's really what the First Amendment is all about. And, there have been people saying, well, the left canceled such and such, and they canceled this and canceled that. See, I'm old enough to remember when one woman wrote a letter to Fox, the TV folks, and she wrote a letter to advertisers. One woman wrote a letter to advertisers that were on Married with Children. Said she had a problem with them advertising their product on that kind of show. And those people started pulling their advertising. One woman did that, right? Now, there's a lot of people that weren't even born that's commenting on what's happening now and all this stuff. But I remember that. And I was just amazed because it was like when we were complaining about stuff, we as Black people, and it was like, well, we're going to do this and do that. And, they were listening to us, but they weren't really hearing us, right? We kind of touched on that in one of the interviews. And so, we didn't seem to have that power. Or when Tipper Gore got mad at NWA and single-handedly pushed for labels to be put on albums, right? So this is not a new phenomenon, what's going on. This has been going on for a long, long time. And, people now saying, well, they tried to cancel Dave Chappelle and they tried to cancel this person and that person and all that stuff. Okay, so individuals complained, but it's a whole different conversation when the federal government is saying, shut that show down, shut this show down, don't write this article, whatever. That's a different level. As a matter of fact, that is exactly why the First Amendment was written. So that government would not interfere in the exercise of free speech. So when the chairman of the FCC decides he wants to play mob boss and say, well, if you don't take this person off the air, we'll have to deal with that. That's the exact reason why the First Amendment was written. Now, if this is, was an individual like that woman way back in the day that wrote the letter to the advertiser saying, don't advertise on that person's show. Well, you got to, if the advertisers decide to do that, that's on them. You know what I'm saying? But, as an individual, okay. But when you work for the federal government, when you are representing the federal government and you're doing that, and you're challenging TV stations, radio stations, podcasters, newspapers, that's a problem. But like I said, we'll dive into that a lot more next week. But I just wanted to get that out there. Nobody wants violence, but nobody should want the federal government to shut things down either. Like I said, they're trying to play a long game. And I saw a clip of Tesla Figaro, and she was challenging Scott Jennings on CNN, and she basically told them to stand in it. Now, Scott may not have understood what she was saying, but she was basically saying, if this is the way you want to play, let's play. If this is the way you want to fight, let's fight. Whereas people of a slightly older but younger generation than me would say, knuck if you buck, right? It's time. She's basically saying, if that's why y'all want to fight, then let's fight. If y'all don't want to talk no more, let's go. If you want to throw hands, we can throw hands. That's what she was saying. Now, I'm hoping that it doesn't get to that point. But ladies and gentlemen, that threshold might have been crossed. If you understand history and you understand what's been going on in the world, things are being used to try to excuse actions. Tragedies are being used as logs on the fire to create an inferno that none of us signed up for. Those of us that are in America, right? There's a lot of people, I don't agree with a lot of stuff they say, especially if you're on X, especially if you're on Instagram, especially if you're on TikTok, right? But they have the right to do that. And the government has no right to shut that down. We talked about stochastic terrorism last week. Stochastic terrorism last week, right? And using words to incite violence. We're not cool with that. But as far as just saying stuff that I may think is stupid, or I say stuff that people may think is stupid, right? We got the right to do that. We got the right to respond and say it's stupid. But the federal government is not supposed to be an active participant in that game. They're not, they're supposed to be neutral. They're not even supposed to be referees. Maybe they shouldn't even be in the stadium. They just might need to be passing by and acknowledge that a game is going on, right? That's the safest thing for the government to do. Until it gets to the point where it's like, okay, well now people are actually getting killed or people are actually fighting in the streets. Yeah, we may need to say something. But outside of that, it's not cool. But again, time's a constraint. You've been very patient and very attentive if you've gotten to this part of the program. So I'm not going to hold you any longer, but yeah, stay tuned because we've got to address this. And, and unfortunately, I'm not the only one that's talking about it, but yeah, we need to address it. All right, guys. Thank you for listening. Until next time.
NBG Podcast Network.